Do your hamstrings feel really tight? Does it make it hard to bend over or even to straighten your knee all the way? These are just a couple of activities that tight hamstrings can interfere with. If you are having a problem with this, I'm really glad you're here because we're going to be talking about my 4 favorite movements to help relieve hamstring tightness. And let me just caveat this right now. It does not include stretching. It is a common misconception that when a muscle is tight, you must stretch it, when that's actually not the case. But you have to think about why a muscle might be tight in the first place. There are a few different reasons, but one primary one is muscles become tight because they are weak. Your body needs stability from somewhere. It takes it either from strength or tightness. So when a muscle becomes tight, you're likely missing this strength component, which is why these 4 exercises are going to focus on hamstring strengthening. Let's get started. This first exercise may not be an exercise you've seen for hamstring strengthening before. It was carefully chosen because it works on 2 things at once. First, typically hamstrings can become tight if you have a tilt forward of your hips. This also may be referred to as an anterior pelvic tilt, which essentially just means that you have an excessive curve in your lower back. Now, when this happens, the hamstrings are now pulled taut. Think of a resistance band, and as you stretch it, it becomes taut. That's what's happening when your hips tilt forward. The good news is you can correct this through exercise, waking up that core and working different muscles. The second one, of course, it's going to be working hamstring strengthening. What I'd like you to do now is stand close to the wall and place your foot on a step stool, a shoe box, basically an elevated surface that's maybe 6 inches or less, where you can feel comfortable elevating your leg. The leg that's elevated is the leg you're going to be working. On the wall, first and foremost, I want you to find the wall with your lower back, meaning tilt your hips back. So now my upper, middle, and lower back are in contact with the wall. This is key to help that anterior pelvic tilt. We're just minimizing that excessive arch, putting that hamstring in a better position. You may need to modify your foot position depending on how this feels. Walking your feet out further may be helpful in finding that wall. This elevated leg can be in front of the stationary leg. Once you found the wall, with this elevated leg, I am pressing into the step stool. Now, you can actually feel your hamstring contract. So go ahead and try to touch that hamstring and see if it feels taut. When a muscle contracts, it tightens, and you typically can feel that. Hold for 3 to 5 seconds and then rest, keeping your low back against the wall the whole time. Press down through the step stool. Now, if you are experiencing knee pain with this, back off a little bit. Don't press as hard. If you're thinking about how hard you can press, try to dial it back to 50%. This isn't like a maximal contraction. We're just putting enough force through this foot that you can elicit this hamstring. You may also feel your quads contract a bit, maybe even your glutes, but we're looking to keep that body in a good position with those hips as you contract the hamstrings. Looking maybe for about 5 to 10 repetitions on one side, and then you will switch to the other side. One of the main movements that the hamstring controls is knee bending. So this muscle helps to bend your knee. For exercise number 2, that's what we're going to be doing. Ideally, you have warmed up the muscle in the previous exercise. So now we're moving that muscle through its range of motion. One of my favorite ways to do this is using upper body support just to control your upper body and give you a little bit more control over your posture. I'm going to start on the right side. Bend your heel up as far as you can. Now, as you're doing this, notice a few things. One, as you're lifting, you're not having any bending side to side of the shoulders, which is where the upper body support comes in. Secondly, as you bend that heel, you're keeping your knees parallel, not allowing that knee to come in front of the stationary one. This allows you to specifically isolate this hamstring. And thirdly, you want to be aware of your posture. So we just touched on that anterior pelvic tilt. I like using that first exercise as you're getting started because your body starts to kind of feel where that position is. Now, when you move to a different exercise, your body already has that awareness. Think about just a really slight tilt of the hips, maybe even just a little squeeze of the glutes to put your hips in a better position. You can use a mirror in front of you for this too, as it may be hard for you to feel because that position likely feels normal for you. So coming out of that position might be difficult to decipher. You're aiming for 10 to 15 repetitions. I like to stay on one side, especially for strengthening, as you start to fatigue out this muscle. You, of course, can be limited by knee bending, so only bend up as far as is comfortable. The higher you lift that heel, the more this muscle is working. So if you do experience a hamstring cramp, which can be common when weakness is present, go ahead and take a brief break, shake it out, allow that cramp to dissipate, and then when you return, minimize the range of motion. If it's still cramping then, that can be your body's sign of saying, hey, I am done with this right now, and then you can revisit it, say, the next day or in a couple of days. Once you start on one side and reach the desired amount of repetitions, then you will move to the other side, doing the exact same thing. Keep the chair for this next exercise because it does help with positioning. Stand about an arm's length away, but enough where you do have a slight bend in the elbows. You don't want to be reaching way out here. Feet are about shoulder width apart, right underneath you. For this hip hinge, you'll have a slight bend in your knees. Almost just think about relaxing your knees. Drive your hips back without more knee bend. Keep your chest up instead of looking down at the floor. I like to think about looking about 2 to 3 feet in front of me. Go until you feel a nice tension through the hamstrings. As you push up to standing, push your weight through the heels of your feet and squeeze your glutes. So you stand up nice and tall. Lead with your hips. Go to that point of tension wherever that is for you, and then squeeze up to standing. One of my favorite tricks for this, if you're like, I don't really necessarily feel it in my hamstrings, is to use a wall for feedback. You'll start in the same exact position, but now you will actually have a target to sit your hips back to, and then squeeze forward. Now, your hamstring tightness is going to dictate how far you are away from the wall. If they are fairly tight, you're going to want to stand just a little closer to the wall, where you can still feel that tension, but you're not reaching and forcing your body to get there. And then squeeze to standing. If you have more mobility, you can bring your chair forward and step further away from the wall. Now, you're reaching, but you're asking those muscles to work in a deeper range of motion, making it more challenging. The idea is to complete this exercise 10 to 20 times until you start to feel some fatigue in those hamstrings. Lastly, we're moving to a bridge. A bridge certainly can be great for hamstring strengthening, but with a few considerations. The biggest one, meaning when you're lying on your back, getting ready to do a bridge. This does not have to be on the floor. It can be on a bed or a couch, but ideally it's on a firmer surface. Find the ground with your lower back, meaning tilt those hips into the floor. You may also even feel an activation of your feet. So if you think about pushing your feet away from you, that will help to tilt those hips back. One of the biggest mistakes I see people doing is a bridge with an arched back. That's not putting your hamstrings in a good position to work optimally. So think about pushing your feet out and finding the ground with your lower back. This is your starting position and your finishing position. I'm going to focus on lifting my hips up, thinking about pushing my weight through my heels as I come down touch with the lower back first. This is more of a controlled movement than just simply doing a ton of bridges. Find the ground and keep that position. Lift your hips up and come back down. Lift your hips up and come back down. One variation of this, if you want to target one side more than the other, is you can do an offset bridge, meaning one foot is just a little bit further out. You are primarily working the leg that's behind. Squeeze up and bring those hips down. Squeeze up. So think about now pushing through this leg that's behind and then come back down. Showing you just the other side. Find the ground with your lower back. Press through your heel of now this right leg and bring that low back to the floor. Now, when it comes to the recommended repetitions, for a regular bridge with your feet in line, the goal is to aim for about 10 to 20 repetitions, but it may need to be gradually worked up to if you start to feel like you lose control through your core and hips, or if you feel like you just aren't getting the height anymore with your hips. Those can be indications that your muscles are fatiguing and you've reached your threshold. For this offset bridge, the repetition scheme will likely be similar. 10 to 20 repetitions each side. Recognize you may fatigue quicker because you're focusing more on one leg. One leg is doing a lot of the work. It may need to be modified accordingly. Now you have 4 total movements to help you strengthen your hamstrings and thus relieve hamstring tightness. You can choose just to focus on one of the movements, or you can include them all. Ideally, you're aiming for 2 to 3 times per week in order to effectively strengthen the muscles. But the key is consistency. It may take a little while for that mobility to start to come. Strengthening the hamstrings can be incredibly important to support your joints like your back, your hips, and your knees. If you enjoyed this video and are serious about improving your joint health so you can continue to adventure, click the subscribe button down below. That will notify you when I release new videos so you don't miss out on the next joint-friendly tips